Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for what promises to be a wonderful conversation about Georgia O'Keeffe and Aaron Douglas, two painters who spent the 1920s approaching the impossible idea of making the city their subject. My name is Ginya Sweeney, and I'm the Director of Interpretation here at the Art Institute of Chicago. A brief reminder before we begin, please silence your mobile devices. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Adrienne Brown and Sarah Kelly Oehler. Adrienne Brown is Associate Professor in the Departments of English and Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. She is the co-editor with Valerie Smith of Race and Real Estate from 2015, and the author of The Black Skyscraper, Architecture and the Perception of Race, published in 2017, and winner of the 2018 First Book Prize from the Modernist Studies Association. Most recently, she's the author of The Residential is Racial, A Perceptual History of Mass Homeownership, published this year. Sarah Kelly Oehler is the Field McCormick Chair and Curator, Arts of the Americas, and Vice President of Curatorial Strategy at the Art Institute of Chicago. She co-curated the Art Institute's current exhibition, Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks. Additionally, in 2018, Oehler co-curated the critically acclaimed exhibition, Charles White, A Retrospective. Among her numerous contributions to other exhibitions and publications is a recent essay on Georgia O'Keeffe's 1943 retrospective here at the Art Institute for the digital publication Exhibiting O'Keeffe, The Making of an American Modernist, published by the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in 2023. Oehler earned her BA in History from Yale University and her PhD in American Art from Columbia University. Now please join me in welcoming Adrienne Brown and Sarah Kelly Oehler.
Well, thank you very much, Ginya, and thank you all for being here tonight. I haven't been outside in a little while, but it was a little gloomy out, so we appreciate you coming out. And I'm very grateful to Adrienne for joining us as well. Adrienne wrote for the catalog for the Georgia O'Keeffe exhibition, and so it's been just a pleasure working with her in the last few years and thinking about two artists that seemingly have nothing in common, but in fact, we think are extremely interesting to consider together. So welcome, Adrienne.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to be in conversation tonight.
Terrific. So we're going to talk a lot about both of these artists, but I thought it would help to get us started a little bit by introducing Aaron Douglas, and then we'll look a little bit at O'Keeffe. So I was hoping, Adrienne, you could start by just sharing a little bit of biography for Douglas for our audience.
Happy to. So this is Douglas actually right before he moves to New York. Before he comes to New York, Douglas is a Midwesterner. He's born in 1899 in Topeka, Kansas. His father is a laborer. His mother is a housewife. He gets introduced to the arts through his mother, who's taking occasional art classes, people coming through town, and he starts to get interested in the arts there. He enrolls in the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 1918, starts working on a degree in fine arts. But to be able to do that, he has to work several jobs. He takes several leaves of absence to be able to put himself through school. And most of the jobs he's taking are industrial and factory jobs, so which take him to different parts of the Midwest. So he goes to Western New York, works in a factory there. He goes to Detroit for a year, works at Cadillac as a plasterer, and then takes classes at the Detroit Art Museum there, free classes at night. He works in Minneapolis, all again to just put himself through school. He graduates in 1922 and starts thinking about going east. Some of his professors are telling him, hey, we think you have what it takes. There are more opportunities for you if you go east. He starts thinking about that, doesn't have the funds. And so as he's trying to make money and make the move east, he starts teaching high school. And this is where this picture is, and he's teaching at Lincoln High School. And he goes back to school. This is kind of a recurring theme in Douglas. He loved being a student, so he went back to school multiple times. So he goes to the University of Kansas and starts a degree in commercial art. I would imagine that's because he is trying to think about the prospects for Black artists at the time and thinking about, the difficulties, which we'll talk a little bit about what it would mean to be a Black artist working in the fine arts and commercial art. I think a commercial degree becomes interesting to him. He's in the Midwest, and he's getting magazines and journals, Black publications that are coming out of Chicago, coming out of New York, and they're getting to him in Topeka and Missouri, all these different places he's at. And he gets the Survey Graphic issue of March 1925, which was a landmark issue. It was about Harlem. It was edited by philosophy professor, kind of Black arts and letters extraordinaire, Alain Locke, and it puts not just Harlem on the map in a new way, but the kind of artistic renaissance that's happening in Harlem. It gets new attention in the Survey Graphic issue. Douglas gets this journal, and he's like, maybe this is where I need to be. And this really spurs him to finally make the move. So he goes in 1925 to New York and is, in some ways, I think, moves quite quickly into the Black art scene in New York. He meets Carl Van Vechten, who would be a big part of O'Keeffe's life. He meets Alain Locke, and almost immediately he's doing illustrations. And for the next kind of 5 years in New York, he's really making his name by illustrating some of the major texts and journals of the Harlem Renaissance while still doing his art practice on the side.
Yeah, so we'll definitely look at some of those journals. But I think what's so interesting here is that O'Keeffe, if I can get the slide to advance, there we go. So here's O'Keeffe at the same time in 1924, and O'Keeffe is about 12 years older, so she is already a slightly more established artist than Douglas by that. And as many of you probably know, she is also, of course, a Midwesterner. She was born in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, and ended up studying here at the Art Institute in 1905 to 1906. She lived here again in 1908 to 1910, working as a commercial illustrator. Very much a similar issue of how to earn a living as an artist. She actually hates being a commercial illustrator, loathed it. And so she left Chicago and ends up moving a lot between Virginia, where her family is resettled. She lives in New York briefly. She goes to teachers college there at Columbia. And then she moves to Texas, and she's teaching in Texas. So for O'Keeffe, the path to being a successful artist was located in working as a teacher and not necessarily in other jobs. But as a woman, this was really the most viable way of earning a living for her. And so she lands in New York a few years earlier than Douglas. She goes to New York in 1918 and actually launches almost immediately into a career. So I think that that's another interesting parallel, that she ends up sort of embarking upon a career with gallery representation that we'll talk about in a minute, is in New York for 6 years before Douglas gets there and before O'Keeffe, in fact, starts painting skyscrapers. So, I think that it's just one of these ways that both of them arrived at skyscrapers at almost the same exact time in their life. And actually, we can show that, but it's the same two photos. But I think we could go on and think about skyscrapers at this moment, because this is a moment for skyscraper imagery. And I think it's so compelling to both of us that they came of age as skyscrapers were being built and moved to New York sort of really at the beginning of an incredible heyday of skyscraper building. And so, I thought we could start talking, how is skyscraper building advancing at this time?
Yeah, this is kind of a really amazing point in the history of this architecture, which really has its roots, a block or two away from us here, downtown Chicago. The first steel structures go up. We have the home insurance building in 1885, 10 stories, being a pretty incredible tall building. And a structure that could be inhabited. You couldn't really get much taller than 10 stories in this period. It's being kind of remarkably tall. And that limit just keeps getting surpassed and surpassed in terms of height, but also the amount of buildings that are getting built. And of course, Chicago and New York become the epicenters of skyscrapers being built elsewise, but in terms of kind of business sense, infrastructure sense, Chicago and New York become the places where the skyscrapers, where we get the most skyscrapers and the tallest skyscrapers. And one thing that I think it's really important to try to do, I think before I started working on skyscrapers, would take them for granted. Like, yeah, they're tall. You know what that is. I've lived with tall buildings my whole life. But imagine, again, when 10 stories was remarkably tall, by the time you get to something like the Empire State Building in 1931, we're at 102 stories.
Even have that here.
And this is in like half a lifetime, right, where these buildings are going up with such speed, and your ability to kind of take them in and understand what they are and wrap your mind and head and body around the scale and the density they're producing and the vantage points, right? It is happening so quickly that it's almost hard for the arts to keep up in a certain sense because they're changing so much. So like Douglas and OKeeffe are really trying to, I think are doing really key work and trying to just figure out how to represent these structures, both just how they look and what they're doing to perception, but symbolically what they stand for and what they mean.
Right. No, it's so true. I mean, and I think that I've thought about this a lot, the fact that for someone like OKeeffe, and we'll talk about her move into the Shelton, this was just unprecedented to actually live at a height. And I think that that's the other thing we take for granted, is that we go up in them easily. But this was not something you had access to. These were, by and large, commercial buildings. So you had to essentially be invited in as maybe an employee at a firm, but if you were a black man without any business there, you probably weren't going to be going into a skyscraper. If you were a woman, maybe. It was a white woman, a little easier. But it was not easy to have access to these spaces. And that was also starting to change, but it meant a lot of grappling with those sorts of issues. So I want to return briefly to the art world that they both enter, because I do think that that really sets the stage for thinking about them a little more. So as I mentioned, OKeeffe arrives in 1918, and she's already 31 years old. So she has, lived a good part, admittedly, of her very, very long life. She dies at 98 years old. But she arrives with an invitation, and she has been invited by Alfred Stieglitz, who you see here on the screen. And he invites her because she has started already producing works of art that he finds extraordinary. And I'm showing you number 8, special drawing number 8 there, which is a 1916 charcoal. And the story is that O'Keeffe's best friend sends them to Stieglitz, and he exclaims, "Finally, a woman on paper," And so there's this immediate embrace of her with very gendered terms by Stieglitz and the Stieglitz Circle. And Stieglitz, I should say, is an extraordinary figure in New York. He is one of the preeminent photographers of the era. He has really spent his entire career trying to achieve a status for photography that would be equal to that of painting. So he's trying to elevate photography as an art form. But he's also the preeminent modernist art dealer and collector and gallery owner at this time. So he immediately is showing O'Keeffe's works and invites her as a result of a relationship that they have developed. And so she really enters the New York art world with both the sort of welcome of Stieglitz and the affirmation of Stieglitz, but with also expectations around her gender and what she should be doing. And I think this seems quite different from Douglas, who arrives without such an obvious entree into New York society.
Yeah, I mean, he arrives, in some ways, he is in some ways very charmed when he arrives. He gets so inspired by the Survey graphic, as I mentioned. He comes, and then months later, he's invited to do some of the illustrations for the book version. People really recognized his talent, and quite quickly, not only recognized his talent, but there was a real hunger for a black artist to represent what was going on in Harlem in this moment, in 1925, when people are really starting to pay attention to Harlem and the art scene that's happening in Harlem, what we call now the Harlem Renaissance. People were just starting to think about it in those terms and looking for a new way to represent what was happening. Elaine Locke, who was one of Douglas's champions and mentors, would talk about this in terms of the new Negro. And this is what this issue of Survey Graphic was trying to describe, this new consciousness that had to do with urbanity, modernity, a new page that was being turned. That for Locke wasn't super political, but was very aesthetic, and there were lots of arguments and disagreements within the Harlem Renaissance. But this is the world that Locke kind of walks into in 1925, where so many people are starting to, the white world is starting to pay attention to Harlem, and people are looking for things to, looking for representations. And Douglas's work really starts to become the kind of main visual motif of so much of the Harlem Renaissance. His images, even today, right, when you think about this period, some of the imagery you see here, even if you've never seen Douglas, this might seem and feel familiar because this iconography is so associated with this period. So he kind of enters this thing with all this promise and responsibility and work to be done, but there are not that many opportunities for him to show his work in a gallery. There are very few galleries that are showing Black art. There's one foundation, the Harmon Foundation, that's dedicated to resourcing and showing Black artists, but otherwise it was really hard to find places to show work. So Douglas primarily works in print. In the 20s. He has his first show in 1933, and he has a lot of success in print, but there are few opportunities for him to show work outside of print in these early years in New York.
Right, and certainly, this is a moment where Stieglitz is showing primarily European artists and very few American artists, but they were largely white artists. And so we've talked about, did Douglas and O'Keeffe know each other? And I will say, we know that they know each other later, but we have searched and searched and not yet found any direct connection. But we do know that there were possibilities there. I mean, this is not the largest art world, and there is finally a lot of movement between sort of the uptown Harlem Black art world and midtown galleries. That is starting more and more.
Yes, yeah. We have a few. If they didn't know each other, they definitely were in close proximity to one another. What you're seeing now is images by Carl Van Vechten, who was close with both. Aaron Douglas did some murals for Van Vechten's bathroom. So we know that even if O'Keeffe didn't meet Douglas, she most likely saw his work at least there, if not other places. They were tied together there. They both were close with Jean Toomer, who was one of the great lights of the Harlem Renaissance, who published this work, Cain. So they both, they were moving in related. Stieglitz, before O'Keeffe comes to the city, he does one of the first major shows of African art in New York in one of his galleries. So he's moved, he has familiarity with that world. So they have these ties and connections. And we can imagine ways they may have interacted and met each other, but even if they didn't physically meet, they were certainly overlapping in the same kind of worlds and circles. Douglas, when he comes to New York, he starts working with the German artist Vinold Ries, whose studio is at that time, I think, on 16th Street. So Douglas is coming downtown. We know he's moving around the city in different ways. He's going to Brooklyn, to the Brooklyn Art Museum to see African art there. And so we know that if they didn't meet, they were certainly moving close to one another.
Right. So I think it's time that we look a little bit more at some art. But I wanted to preface this by saying that Douglas and O'Keeffe are not unique in depicting skyscrapers at this moment. There's a lot of interest. There's such interest in skyscrapers that, in fact, there's an entire term, Skyscraper Mania, that is very commonly used for this moment. And it goes on for decades. And so I'm showing you what will look like two very different choices in depicting skyscrapers. One is the Child Hassam 1907 painting, where you can see it's about light and shadow and the people of the city dwarfed by these probably still fairly short buildings at this point, which is in very specific contrast to something like Charles Sheeler, which is cubist and very hard-edged, precise in its depiction. It's anonymous, it's vertiginous. So there is a sort of sea change in how the skyscraper is being depicted, and that's the world that O'Keeffe and Douglas both enter into. But I think that you and I have also talked about how there's so many elements of nationalism also involved in depicting a skyscraper, that this is a moment where it's not just about the aesthetic interest of the skyscraper, but a real sense of American progress that they are both also engaging with.
Yeah, there are so many debates in this period about even how to talk about the skyscraper. Do you think about it as art? You know, it was invented as for this very functional purpose, right? So there was even a question of whether to talk about it as an artistic revolution or whether to really claim it as an infrastructure, even an economic revolution, right? There's so many different ways of thinking about this structure and how it was starting to come to stand in for the U.S. in this moment where the U.S. is really trying to make its name on the global stage, and the skyscraper ultimately comes to play a really important role in that. And this quote here is from Theodore Roosevelt during his presidency. He gives a speech, I think it's at the Corcoran, really trying to speak to this moment and speak to both the skyscraper but also the urbanity that it was starting to represent. The U.S. becomes majority urban only, I think, in around 1910. So the skyscraper is also starting to represent where more and more people in the U.S. are living. And so it's, you know, people are really trying to grapple with what does it mean for the skyscraper to now be the symbol of America. And you see Roosevelt trying to grapple with this here. I'll just read a little bit of this quote where he's trying to imagine how this icon will be represented. And he says, "A great artist will yet arise to bring before our eyes the powerful, irregular skyline of the great city at sunset or in the noonday brightness, and above all at night, when the lights flash from the dark mountainous mass of buildings, from the stately bridges that span the East River, and from the myriad craft that blaze as they ply to and fro across the waters."
Right. And so I think there's a real, certainly O'Keeffe spent much of her life trying very hard to be a great artist. Not a great woman artist, a great artist. And what's fascinating for me is that she was immediately transformed by one event. So for her, painting the city, painting skyscrapers, and you see this in her art, is very personal, and it all stems from her moving into an actual skyscraper, which you see here, the Shelton Hotel. And she talked about how it was so high up, and the Shelton is the first residential skyscraper that allows people to live above the 11th floor. So she moves in and moves eventually to the 30th floor, which is the top residential floor. And so her entire experience of New York, even as she's trying to depict it, or of skyscrapers, I should say, is one of personal connection to it. And I think that that's an important difference with Douglas that we'll get into. But she was told that this was, and this was her phrase, an impossible idea. She said, "I had never lived up so high before, and I was so excited that I began talking about trying to paint New York. Of course, I was told that it was an impossible idea. Even the men hadn't done too well with it," which for O'Keeffe just meant that she would double down and paint more. And so, she is faced with the impossible idea based on her gender, that her gender somehow precluded her from painting the city, that it was a masculine form, that it was something that certainly no woman would want to paint. Why would she dirty her hands with this? And this is certainly the attitude that Stieglitz has, and her cohorts in the Stieglitz circle. But she really persists, and we can look. Oops, here's just a fun shot. I should say the Shelton that she moves into is quite luxurious, and so these are some of the amenities of the Shelton. She didn't have to cook. She had her studio there. It was, for her, I think, quite the experience also. But she perseveres, and you see her painting works such as this. This is her first image, New York Street with Moon. And to me, and I think we should talk about this is very much reflects her as the perceptor, if you will. She is trying to convey her own presence in this painting, looking up. She's abstracting form. She's interested in, natural effects, but she's interested in how she has received them and wants to translate them. And so Douglas is faced with a different impossible idea that's not based in his own perception in quite the same way.
Yeah, I mean, and this just to give you a sense of where, Douglas was living. He lived at a couple of different places in Harlem. He was like one of these figures who really spanned the expanse of the Harlem Renaissance, slumming it with the kind of young crew, Zora Neale Hurston, Wallace Thurman, Bruce Nugent, who were kind of loud and abrasive and trying to make a new name for themselves, and the kind of older statesmen of the Renaissance like Alain Locke and W.B. Du Bois. Douglas was kind of moving through all of those circles, and he eventually lives in 409 Edgecombe Avenue, which is kind of one of the legendary addresses in Harlem. It was in Sugar Hill, which was where the most elite in Harlem lived. And, for Harlem, this was a pretty tall residential building, one of the tallest. We know that Van Vechten came here to see Walter White and probably Douglas as well. So there are a lot of people moving in this space. And then Alila Walker, who was the daughter of Madam C.J. Walker, the first black female millionaire, had this huge mansion called it was colloquially known as the Dark Tower. So there was a lot of play, even if there wasn't like the same kind of verticality you would see in Midtown or downtown. There were still the kind of tropes of verticality that were doing, similar work that they were doing where the kind of hub of the skyscrapers were.
Right. And so looking at this, I mean, this is an early skyscraper, relatively speaking, for Douglas. Oh, that's 29. But he's, sort of starts upon a language of the skyscraper that's not based on him.
No, and he doesn't really have the opportunity to do that because the impetus of the Harlem Renaissance, right, is so much about a debate around representation and how to represent this new spirit, how to represent blackness, right? There's a real conversation happening in the Harlem Renaissance. And part of what Douglas's work intervenes in and tries to do is to think about how blackness exists, looks, feels, should be rendered in the 20s, right? With this new black urban population, the Great Migration really starts kicking off in 1917, 1918, around World War I, when blacks are moving north to escape the South, but also to take advantage of new opportunities to work. And so Douglas is trying to capture an image of black striving, black ambition, but also the sense that blackness has always been a part of modernity. Making a real argument and intervention by putting black bodies, black motifs, and putting them right next to skyscrapers in a way to insist that blackness is so important to understanding an urban framework. And so in some ways, like, he could not afford to not be putting the body front and center in terms of its representation in the images that he made that were really becoming the hallmark illustrations of this new Negro Harlem Renaissance movement.
Yeah, and I think, this is, I brought these two together because I think this is really illustrative. O'Keeffe had the luxury, in many ways, of not having to include a symbolism or a sort of narrative of blackness or femininity or whatever. She really could also be free to paint a pure abstraction in a way that Douglas, although he is always very aligned with ideas of abstraction, needs to keep some form of physical representation visible in his works. And I think you see that here, where stylistically there's interesting, they're both interested in sort of the play of colors, of the way that light and shadow play across these compositions, but very different.
Yeah, and I think, Douglas was really interested, they're really interested in flatness and form. Douglas just has a different set of, we know that Douglas, for instance, in this period was painting in other styles and forms. We have watercolor still lifes that are working in a real different range than the ones that he became most known for. But because the works that he mostly doing illustrations for were for magazines like The Crisis, which was one of the kind of most important black magazines in this period, edited by W.B. Du Bois, right? And it was going to be the cover, right? Like, Douglas really had to think about how to represent not himself or what he was thinking or feeling, right? But again, to give voice to the millions who were reading The Crisis, and both black and white audiences were trying to understand something about, again, what this new moment in black history was presenting.
Yeah, I think this one, likewise, here we actually have this figure on the dust jacket here of the James Weldon Johnson book, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, where he's actually staring at a skyscraper. And O'Keeffe is also staring at a skyscraper, but she's staring, of course, at her home, and she renders it in this incredible visual blind, array. She's really much more interested in how she is blinded in some ways in the city, whereas Douglas is very much about looking at the skyscraper
and making a claim to it, right? Like looking at it from a distance in a way to kind of both kind of suggest just a distance, but also a closeness, right? And a tie. Douglas's art really thinks about the triangulation in this period between questions around, are blacks American, right? How to think about the relationship between blackness and Americanness, and also to think about the question of Africa and African Americans, right? One of the most famous poems in this period, what is Africa to me? And so, Douglas's iconography, right? taking inspiration from African art, putting it next to skyscrapers, he's really trying to ask questions and also show a kind of different range of influences in terms of how to think about this movement now. And again, to never just say, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of primitivism in this period, right? Where people were thinking about Harlem and thinking about Africa and jungle beats and going to jazz clubs, right? And really trying to think about Harlem in a kind of animalistic sensibility. And you see Douglas here really trying to take some of these African elements and create a different kind of iconography in this period.
Yeah, I've been fascinated by how many works by Douglas have a structure in which the figure is looking up at the skyscraper in very much an aspirational way. I think that there's sort of this constant seeking of it. And again, O'Keeffe is living it. So she is already living this in this world. She's able to look down from the 30th floor, as you see in the work on the left, in which this is the view she owns, essentially. And I think that's just a dichotomy there between the two, that it works so symbolically for Douglas as this sort of goal, a goal that O'Keeffe, as someone who had not earned a lot of money in this point, but she'd finally been able to stop teaching and finally could earn a living as a painter, in part because of skyscrapers. So it's a different form of claim on the city.
Yeah, and I think of O'Keeffe's images of skyscrapers being so much about capturing it in real time, in the present, even if they're very worked on and constructed, right? But it is about this moment of translating a bodily experience onto the canvas. And Douglas, his skyscrapers are never of a specific skyscraper, or rarely, right? They're always symbols. Yeah, you can never quite place them either in space or in time, right? Because he's so interested in this kind of trans-historical story to tell through the skyscraper, where there's one way to think about the skyscraper as the kind of pinnacle of modernity, of civilization, right? But for Douglas, he's always trying to situate this kind of new, shiny, bright symbol of aspiration of the modern in relationship to the black bodies and labor and wealth that have been stolen and taken, and putting that all into the context of how we got to the skyscraper. Right. And insisting we can never think about these structures without thinking about blackness, which is a pretty revolutionary thing to be claiming in this period, and still today, I think.
Yeah, and so, here I will say I've been long fascinated by the appearance. So the Shelton with Sunspots is in the Art Institute's collection. So I've spent a lot of years just tracking it down in various representations. And what I find fascinating is that here O'Keeffe actually does bring in an element of social commentary, which is so prevalent in Douglas's own work. And here he is picturing the burden of black womanhood. But O'Keeffe actually does allow her works to be reproduced, such as the Shelton, in vehicles such as the Survey, so the same exact magazine that inspired Douglas. It's a magazine that was very much a progressive magazine. And it here is used as the sort of introduction to an article about poverty and unemployment in the United States. Like, this article is called "The Shadows of Prosperity." And so here is this painting that introduces this idea of how in 1928, we're not yet at the crash, but it is this sort of moment of economic tension. And so O'Keeffe's paintings, although not painted for these purposes, end up sometimes functioning in this way, which I find a nice sort of fascinating tie-in, but one that is much rarer than Douglas's full steam ahead, constant advocacy.
Mm-hmm. And Douglas, he would kind of adopt different styles for different causes. So he ends up doing an image, a much more kind of realistic rendering of the Scottsboro Boys in the 30s, a group of African Americans who were wrongfully accused, and starts to try to really agitate through his art for their release. So even he's like kind of moving and adopting different styles for different means and purposes in this period.
Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about actual mural painting, because this is one point where O'Keeffe, who is not normally a muralist, does sort of intersect with Douglas, who in fact became one of the more exceptional muralists of this moment. And so for O'Keeffe, it comes as an aesthetic commission almost. The Museum of Modern Art asks her to paint a mural in 1932 for an exhibition they were holding for a possible mural idea on the city that was never actually implemented, so it didn't go anywhere. And O'Keeffe designs a 3-part mural that includes this incredible image of Manhattan. So the skyscraper is more symbolically used here, which she combines, incidentally, with flowers that she had brought from the Southwest. But this is a one-off for her. She is not thinking about public spaces, and yet Douglas and the skyscraper start gracing public spaces in fairs and in all sorts of universities. Yeah, and so I think that is another sort of touch point, but also then another very notable divergence in how they approach skyscraper painting.
Yeah, it is really, Douglas starts getting mural commissions in the 30s, and so people start seeing his illustrations, and then he starts taking these commissions. So in some ways, again, he's never able to really, it's much harder for him to just have a kind of oil and canvas show, but he can do murals and he can do these illustrations. And I think it also speaks to another piece of Douglas's work, which is the collaborative piece of it too, where when he's doing journals, he's illustrating book covers, he's always working with people. They're always his ideas, right? But he's working with other people on these ideas, and
lots of people can see these
and
too.
Lots of people can see them. And just thinking about scale too. One thing I hadn't really thought about until thinking about Douglas and O'Keeffe together is the way that they are both interested in mixing the natural world and the skyscraper. Again, is some of the images we saw, and I think even here, though less in this one, the skyscraper, again, the symbol of modernity, is often juxtaposed with palm fronds and different kinds of trees, right? Making a different claim, I think, than O'Keeffe about what it means to bring those two things together. For Douglas, again, it's about bringing together, thinking about rurality and the urban and the modern and all the different places that Black bodies have moved to produce the modern. But on these this monumental scale for O'Keeffe and Douglas, is they can really play, I think, with these different kinds of juxtapositions, these different kind of hard and soft edges, these different scales, which is, again, I think, another remarkable thing about the way that they both work with the skyscraper and play with its scale and do different things with it.
Yeah. And we could not resist. We absolutely wanted to just show you this at least. In that Douglas does do a mural on Chicago, and he does another mural that was at the Sherman Hotel here in Chicago that is, now not extant. But we love, in fact, that both of them have these moments in Chicago that we wanted to touch on. So we have a few more minutes before we turn to questions, and we welcome all of your questions. But I did want to just briefly note that both of them really master the use of black pigment in their work. And, for O'Keeffe in City Night, it's to make something foreboding. But her blacks are never uniform. They're very modeled. They have a lot of sort of life and quality and variation to their blacks, which almost never can you tell in reproduction, but in person you can see it. Whereas Douglas is really, black is such a common motif. And I'm just curious, do you find that, I mean, it's not modeled, it's partly because it's printed, but I imagine it's also very much a powerful statement on his part.
Yeah, I mean, I love this image here of Home to Harlem, because if you can see from the detail, like there's one, the two hands are up. On the one side is Trinity Church. On the other side, I don't, again, one of these buildings, it's hard to know which one it is. And when the hand that's next to Trinity Church kind of gets close but doesn't touch, but the other hand is touching the structure, right? So in some ways, they all become one in the way that he depicts them, right? All of this kind of one shade of darkness, of blackness, right, that moves from the body into the skyscraper, right? Creating
he's the connector.
He's the connector. There's no, you don't get the skyscraper without this body, right? And elevating this body, to the same kind of scale or similar scale. And I think Douglas works to. He's only working in 2 colors here, but he works to such great effect. And then when he moves into the murals, right, there's grayscale, there's all these different ways just the way he works with color.
And certainly both of them work with color, I will say, is pretty
hard
exceptional.
Colors, soft colors, electric colors, really dark colors, like, the way that they both, I think about them, again, this show has made me think much differently about seeing similarities between them in terms of this kind of the soft romanticness that they could paint in, but also the kind of the ways they could use a color like black to do so many different kinds of things.
Right. So one of the things I did note about this as I was thinking about the slides to bring tonight is just that O'Keeffe actually does stop largely painting New York City, although she keeps returning to it now and then. But, that's really sort of from 1925 to 1932 is sort of the heyday. And Douglas persists in painting skyscrapers and their imagery for years, for decades to come. And, which I think shows the power of it and its ongoing power for him in his career. But of course, they both do leave New York behind. And this is finally where we can get to the moment where we absolutely know that the pair of them meet. And that's because O'Keeffe, of course, famously goes to New Mexico. And in 1946, Stieglitz dies, her husband, and she has to spend 3 years dealing with his estate. It's, for her, a bit of a nightmare. Stieglitz had wanted everything to go to one place, which she thought was ludicrous, and told him that. And so she ended up dividing his collection, his entire extraordinary collection of European and American modernism and of photography, between largely three institutions. One is the Art Institute, which is how we are so incredibly fortunate. I'm like the most lucky curator in the world. One is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They're lucky for many reasons. And the third is Fisk University, which is a very unexpected choice, given sort of that it is a HBCU, a black university in Nashville, Tennessee, and she gives 1/3 of Stieglitz's estate to Fisk University. And that's where we know that she and Douglas meets, because that's where Douglas is gone.
Yeah, Douglas starts teaching at Fisk full time in the late 30s, and is definitely on the scene when the collection is given.
Yeah, and he establishes the art department there, and so she visits. And it's long been sort of uncertain why she ends up giving this collection to Fisk. One reason is very certainly Carl Van Vechten, who we mentioned earlier as a possible connector between O'Keeffe and Douglas. Van Vechten helps introduce O'Keeffe to Fisk, helps establish the gift there. And but the other reason that is, I think, quite true is that O'Keeffe very much wanted Stieglitz's legacy to have a place in the South. And she went to Fisk, and she actually talked in her opening speech about how she wanted to ensure that his paintings could be seen by everybody. And she knew that if she had given them to a Southern white institution, a mainstream institution, that half of the population wouldn't be able to see them. So she chose Fisk in part because of that goal of greater access to the Stieglitz collection. It wasn't always a perfect relationship, I will say, but ultimately she really felt that this was important. And what's fascinating to me, and we can sort of wrap up on this note, is that O'Keeffe gave 2 of her paintings to Fisk. Stieglitz actually didn't own her paintings, so she did not have to give any of her paintings to Fisk. But one of the 2, one was a skull painting, or excuse me, a bone painting, and the other was a skyscraper painting. And so I keep coming back to this fact that of all the paintings, she had hundreds of paintings at her disposal of her own works, and she chose to give probably one of her most important skyscraper paintings to the same institution where Aaron Douglas was. So again, I am positing this, but it is a sort of lovely speculative thought to think about how this became another point of connection for the 2 of them.
Yeah, and not only was Douglas teaching at Fisk, he had painted some of his most important murals are at Fisk.
With skyscrapers.
With skyscrapers in them. So again, thinking about them as, forever living close to one another is a really kind of incredible thought.
Yeah. So I think with that note, we would love to turn to questions from you and see if there's any questions from the audience. So I'm going to say there is a microphone somewhere circulating. And if people have questions, please just raise your hand, and Miguel and my other colleagues can help get them.
Hi, I have 2 questions based on the information that you provided. Why is this particular picture owned by Fisk and Crystal Bridge Museum? And then why, because I used to live in Wisconsin, is Douglas's picture at the executive, this one, at the executive residence in Madison, which I visited several times. So I'm just very curious about that.
All right. Well, I'll start with the first question, which is why is this now also owned by Crystal Bridges? This is unfortunately a not uncommon story with a lot of the HBCUs where they, and frankly a lot of universities, so this is not just only HBCUs, that find that they need money, and so their art collections, and this happened at a number of institutions across the country. It's actually happening now in Valparaiso, Indiana. They find that they need to make money, and the collection becomes a vehicle for that. And so there's an entire history, actually, of a court case that happened around the Fisk collection, and so it was felt very strongly that it should still be accessible to the students. And so essentially a half share was sold to Crystal Bridges. So the paintings all en masse, the entire Stieglitz collection, moves back and forth between Fisk and Crystal Bridges so that the students still have access to them. And then for Madison, I'm actually assuming it was a commission.
Yeah, he was commissioned to do a mural in the governor's mansion. This is kind of the incredible thing about Douglas, that he gets commissioned to do a mural in Texas for the centennial. He gets commissioned to do by Holabird and Roche to do their hotel down here, and so he's being commissioned all across the country for murals for decades, and they end up in really kind of surprising and interesting places.
No. Other questions? Looks like there's one over here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for a really wonderful discussion, very provocative. So 2 things. One is, as skyscrapers moved around the world, do you find a similar skyscraper mania afflicting the art communities there? And secondly, do you have any anecdotes involving James Baldwin?
Oh, interesting. So interestingly, certainly in the 1920s and 30s, the period we're looking at, skyscrapers might start cropping up, but most people are coming to New York and marveling at the skyscrapers. Mm-hmm. So there actually are a lot of artists who come to New York and see the skyscraper as this quintessentially American form, and so they're painting it, but they're painting it because they're visiting the United States. I haven't, and I'd have to really think, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that happening elsewhere. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I think people I'm guilty of it too. You kind of, if you're Chicago and you drive down Lakeshore every day, you can get really immune to this spectacularity. I think we've now had the skyscraper for over 100 years as a structure, right?
So they're not people don't get the mania because they're sort of old hat, I guess.
That's a hypothesis. It's not that no one's painting them, but I think, again, so many of these artists were trying to capture this brand new experience of what it meant to kind of grow up and live your life as these buildings are going up with, again, not only going up at record heights, but many more of the buildings are just existing, right, overall. So you have quantity and kind of, so people are trying to wrap their head around this. And I think at a certain moment, they wrap their head around it and they move on in some ways.
Right. Yeah, certainly, O'Keeffe, we know, destroyed a number of her skyscraper paintings. And again, she destroyed many things. She destroyed things she was not happy with, but it does, the number that she actually painted of the Shelton and destroyed suggests, in fact, that she struggled, that she wasn't happy with what she was doing and wanted to sort of start over and over again until she got it. And the Shelton with Sunspots is by far the one that she acknowledged to be her best of the Sheltons. So we're happy that, she got there. But yeah, I think it's just different as time progresses.
Yeah. And then your question about Baldwin, my mind, again, there's another connector, I think, between O'Keeffe and Douglas potentially, was Buford Delaney.
Yes.
Who was an amazing artist. And Douglas knew Delaney, and O'Keeffe actually ends up painting these incredible pictures of Delaney.
Right. There's one in the Art Institute's collection that we acquired maybe like 5 years ago that is extraordinary, and I didn't bring a slide of it, but a really beautiful, O'Keeffe is not a portraitist, and she does actual beautiful portraits of Beaufort Delaney.
Yeah.
And
Baldwin, this is not so much directly to O'Keeffe and Douglas, but Baldwin does write this essay talking about how, he lists things like Shakespeare. He talks about the Empire State Building as having kind of no connection to Black life and Black people. He writes this in the mid-century, and then, you kind of think about Douglas making a very different kind of argument in the 20s and 30s about Blackness, Black people, and skyscrapers. So, you kind of see the skyscraper moving through different people's intellectual and artistic trajectories and doing different work for them.
Yeah.
We have one in the back corner over here.
All right. Thanks, Miguel.
Thank you both so much for this lovely talk. I was curious if you'd be able to share any other artists, whether visual, writers, musicians, that these two artists specifically looked to for their cityness that they found as inspirations.
So this is where, I earlier showed the Charles Sheeler, and Sheeler is, I think, definitely somebody who O'Keeffe was friends with Sheeler, so across the board, she knew of what he was doing. And he and Paul Strand, and O'Keeffe actually had a romantic relationship with Paul Strand, who was a photographer. Strand was also photographing the city, and then, for that matter, Stieglitz was photographing the city. But Strand and Sheeler actually create a movie in 1920 called Manhattan that takes the city as its subject, and I definitely know that O'Keeffe would have known of this as well. So I think those three, sort of Sheeler, Strand, and Stieglitz, would have been the closest for O'Keeffe as a model, but she never does anything quite like them. And I mentioned Manhattan because that film actually does feature nature in a way that Sheeler's and Strand's own photographs often don't. And so, because they're filming the city, which means you get all the steam and the natural effects. But other than those sort of actual tie-ins of nature, their works don't, in fact, necessarily bear much resemblance to O'Keeffe. So she takes it, but she knows it, but she is determined to do her own thing.
Douglas, he comes to this city so hungry and wants to take it all in. So he's working, I think I already mentioned, with this German artist who sets up shop in New York, Vinnold Rees, who is known for doing lots of things. He's painting Native Americans in the Southwest. He's painting both the Black elite and school teachers in Harlem. He's doing interiors. And so again, Douglas trying to straddle both commercial and fine art worlds. Vinnold Rees is a big influence on him, and stylistically, and I think in terms of kind of a model for a career. And then, Douglas, the Harlem Renaissance ended up being quite a small world. So, he's talking to people like Rudolph Fischer, who writes one of these great, a short story in this period where a young Black child goes downtown and goes to the top of the skyscraper and describes his experience. Or W.B. Du Bois, who's one of his mentors, who writes these kind of sci-fi skyscraper stories in the early 20th century. And so Douglas is moving in and taking inspiration from so many places across the color line, art, literature, music, and his, as you can see even from this image, Song of the Tires from 1966, which features music being played. Music is such a part of the way he painted and what he tried to incorporate there.
Yeah. Oh, I will just add, Douglas always has these concentric rings of light that bring you in and focus in, and here that's so beautifully done on the saxophone itself in that. So I can't tell, do we have any more questions from the audience?
We have time for one
One
more
more?
question, and I think Mel has somebody in the front here.
Right over here. All right, perfect.
One thing that I noticed both in O'Keeffe's work and in Douglas's work is the use of leaning skyscrapers. And I wonder if you could comment on that as an artistic strategy. Thank you.
Absolutely. Do you want to start or shall I?
I can start. I mean, I think they're both interested in trying to conjure an experience of the skyscraper, while also rejecting a certain kind of realism at the same time, right? And so I think there's something to the lean and the sway. And they were certainly not the only ones who were representing the skyscrapers in this way. Steichen has an image of the skyscraper kind of on this photograph of the skyscraper, also on a slant, right? So I think...
Or John Marin. I think of like the shakiness of a John Marin watercolor of New York City.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it may be too far forward but I'm thinking about the crisis image where the buildings are kind of, you don't know if they're coming up or they're going down. This one, right? Like I've just spent a lot of time looking at this and be like, are they rising or are they falling? How is he thinking about this kind of movement, right? And I think for Douglas in particular, for him, it's about representing a kind of kineticism and dynamism around these buildings, and also a kind of softness to them, right? That he's also really interested in, even though he's got these kind of flat, jagged silhouettes, right? There's still a kind of softening of their edges here too. So I think that's part of what I think he's doing with some of this tilting and leaning.
Yeah, and I think with O'Keeffe, what to me is so evident in a number of compositions is how there's the central building, and I have no idea now where I have one of these pictures, but there's the central building like you see with the Shelton with sunspots here, but there's the ones that come in from the side, and this is O'Keeffe's own desire, I think, to show that she is capturing these as she's moving. So O'Keeffe loved to walk the city, and when you walk, nothing is ever straight. Like you never can look at anything straight on, and that was her experience over and over again. And she loved what she called the sky shapes, which are these sort of funny, jagged areas of sky that would show up here with all the steam rising up around it. And so I think the lean is really about how not regular sometimes the experience of a skyscraper could be, which again feels somewhat in contrast to some of these other artists who are very interested in the rectilinearity of a skyscraper. She is interested in exactly anything but, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of, in O'Keeffe, but sometimes in Douglas too, right? The skyscraper almost becomes like a viewfinder. Like it is a frame for sight. Like it is changing the ways that, empty space and open space looks, and literally framing your vision, right? So here, the skyscrapers are the subject, but they're also the frame. You get that too, I think, in Douglas too, the way that they kind of use open and empty space, right? And the architecture literally is carving out that space, and I think those angles really help make that really clear.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight for this program. And thank you for your wonderful questions, and we hope you enjoy the show if you hadn't had a chance to see it yet. Have a good night.